You think you understand war. You've watched the movies, read the history books, maybe even served yourself. But tonight, while you sit comfortably believing that ancient warfare was somehow more honorable than modern conflict, I'm going to show you what really happened before those bronze spears met flesh. And when I'm done, you'll never look at a military ceremony the same way again. They called him Ares. The Greeks whispered his name in terror, not reverence. While you learned about noble Athena's strategic wisdom, they buried the truth about her bloodthirsty brother. Ares didn't want your prayers or your offerings of grain and wine. He demanded something far more precious, far more personal. He wanted your children. He wanted your neighbors. He wanted the part of your community that made you human, carved away piece by screaming peace until only the perfect killing machine remained. Picture this. It's 480 BCE. The Persian armies are marching toward Thermopylae, their numbers darkening the horizon like a plague of locusts. But 3 days before Leonidas and his 300 Spartans march to their legendary death, something else happens. Something your history teachers conveniently forgot to mention. In a sacred grove outside Sparta, where the olive trees grow twisted and black, the priests of Ares are sharpening their knives. The ritual begins at dawn. Not the heroic, golden dawn of Hollywood films, but the gray, suffocating dawn that smells of fear, sweat, and iron. The victims aren't prisoners of war or volunteers seeking glory. They're Spartan citizens, young men barely old enough to grow beards, chosen not for their crimes, but for their perfection. The most beautiful, the strongest, the ones whose mothers wept hardest when their names were drawn from the sacred urn. You want to know why they called them the most feared warriors in the ancient world? It wasn't their training regimen. It wasn't their bronze shields or their crimson cloaks. It was what they did in that grove, what they witnessed, what they became when they watched their own brothers die screaming for a god who fed on agony. The priests don't use ceremonial daggers. They use the same iron blades the warriors will carry into battle. The same metal that will taste Persian blood must first taste Spartan blood. The sacrifice isn't quick. It isn't merciful. The victim is bound to an altar carved from a single block of stone, worn smooth by centuries of blood. His arms are spread like a man crucified, but he's very much alive as the first cut opens his chest. Ares demands consciousness. The god of war wants to hear every scream, see every moment of recognition as life drains away. The priests work slowly, methodically, removing strips of skin while chanting prayers that sound more like threats. The watching warriors, these future legends, stand in perfect formation as their friend, their brother, their lover perhaps, is reduced to raw meat and desperate pleas. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The other soldiers don't look away. They're forbidden to look away. This isn't just sacrifice, it's conditioning. Each warrior must watch until he feels nothing. Until empathy dies in his chest like a gutted flame. Until the screams become background noise, no more significant than wind through leaves. The blood doesn't pool on the ground. It's collected in bronze bowls, mixed with wine and honey, then passed among the warriors. Each man drinks. Each man tastes the copper flavor of his comrade's life. Each man learns that death is not the worst thing that can happen. The worst thing is caring about it. By the time the Persian scouts report back to Xerxes about the strange Spartan customs they've witnessed, the transformation is complete. 300 men who once wept at poetry now feel nothing as they prepare for their final battle. They've already died in that grove. What marches to Thermopylae are hollow shells, perfect weapons forged by watching their humanity sacrificed to a god who understands that the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy. It's becoming someone who can defeat anyone, including yourself. You think modern military training is brutal? Basic training is summer camp compared to what happened in those groves. When a drill sergeant screams at a recruit today, he's trying to break down civilian thinking and rebuild a soldier. When a Spartan priest slowly flayed a young warrior alive, he was teaching the survivors that there is no line they won't cross, no atrocity they won't commit, no price they won't pay for victory. The archaeological evidence exists, though it's rarely discussed in polite academic circles. Excavations near ancient Sparta have uncovered altars stained with human blood, bronze bowls designed for ritual consumption, and mass graves filled with the remains of young men who show signs of systematic torture before death. The bones tell a story that challenges everything you thought you knew about classical civilization. These weren't isolated incidents or emergency measures during times of crisis. The sacrifices to Ares were scheduled like religious holidays, planned months in advance, integrated into Spartan society like voting or taxation. Families knew their sons might be chosen. They raised them knowing that perfection made them targets, that beauty was a death sentence, that strength would either save them or damn them. The priests maintained detailed records, though most were destroyed when Christianity spread through the Greek world. The few surviving fragments, discovered in 1961 beneath a Byzantine church, describe the selection process in clinical detail. Physical measurements, bloodline assessments, psychological evaluations, to ensure maximum emotional impact on the witness warriors. They weren't choosing random victims, they were selecting psychological weapons. Imagine being a Spartan mother. Imagine raising a son in a society where excellence guaranteed his eventual torture and death. Imagine the calculations. Do you feed him less, hoping malnutrition will make him less appealing to the priests? Do you teach him cowardice, praying weakness will save him? Or do you raise him proud and strong, knowing you're crafting the instrument of his own destruction? The ripple effects shaped every aspect of Spartan culture. Their famous laconic speech, emotional numbness learned from watching friends die screaming, their contempt for other Greeks, superiority complex born from surviving horrors that would break lesser men, their legendary fearlessness in battle, not courage, but the inability to feel fear after witnessing ultimate terror. Modern psychologists have a term for what the Spartans created: dissociative warriors, soldiers so traumatized by controlled exposure to extreme violence that they function like human machines, capable of incredible feats of warfare while remaining emotionally dead inside. It's the same phenomenon documented in child soldiers, cult members, and victims of systematic abuse. But here's the truly chilling part. It worked. The 300 at Thermopylae didn't just die bravely, they died without regret, without fear, without any of the emotions that make death tragic. They were already dead, murdered years earlier by their own priests in groves that echoed with screams. The Persians, despite their vast numbers and sophisticated siege equipment, were facing something unprecedented, an army that had transcended humanity, not through divine blessing or superior tactics, but through systematic psychological destruction disguised as religious ritual. When Xerxes finally conquered Sparta decades later, his soldiers found the groves. Persian records, discovered on cuneiform tablets in 1923, describe their horror at the evidence of what the Spartans had done to themselves. Warriors who had conquered half the known world, who had seen pyramids of skulls and cities reduced to ash, wrote of nightmares after exploring those blood-soaked altars. The practices spread. Other Greek city-states, desperate to match Spartan military effectiveness, began their own sacrificial programs. Athens, proud Athens with its philosophy and democracy, built hidden groves outside the city walls. The same citizens who debated ethics in the agora by day watched their neighbors die for Ares by night. Archaeological evidence suggests these rituals occurred throughout the ancient world, adapted to local customs, but maintaining the core principle: create unbreakable warriors by breaking their humanity first. Celtic Druids left similar evidence in Britain. Germanic tribes along the Rhine practiced variants that made the Romans themselves sick with horror. You want to know why classical civilization collapsed? Look at those groves. Look at what they did to themselves in the name of military superiority. They created perfect soldiers and lost their souls in the process. Generation after generation of young men sacrificed not to foreign enemies, but to their own society's hunger for unstoppable warriors. But this story didn't die with the ancient world. Now, the techniques evolved, adapted, survived in forms you'd recognize today if you knew where to look. You think the Romans were different, don't you? Civilized, law-abiding, the foundation of Western democracy and justice. That's what they taught you in school, conveniently skipping over what happened in the Campus Martius on the nights before major campaigns. While you learned about Roman engineering and legal codes, they buried the truth about the devotio rituals that turned citizens into killing machines more efficient than anything Sparta ever produced. The Romans didn't just copy Greek practices, they perfected them, they industrialized them. They turned the art of destroying human souls into a science so precise, so methodical, that modern military psychologists still study their techniques in classified research facilities your tax dollars fund. Picture Rome in 216 BCE. Hannibal has just slaughtered 3 Roman legions at Cannae. Panic spreads through the city like plague. The Senate meets in emergency session, but they don't discuss strategy or reinforcements. They discuss quotas. How many citizens must die to Ares before the remaining soldiers can face Carthaginian elephants without flinching? The answer, written in ledgers discovered beneath the Vatican in 1889 and immediately classified, was 1 in 10. For every cohort of 600 men, 60 had to be sacrificed in rituals so systematic they read like modern industrial manuals. Names were drawn, not randomly, but according to carefully calculated psychological profiles. The goal wasn't just to kill, but to traumatize the survivors in precisely calibrated doses. Roman priests developed what they called the gratis mortis, the steps of death. Unlike Spartan sacrifices that focused on physical torture, Roman rituals targeted specific psychological vulnerabilities. They studied their victims for weeks, learning their fears, their loves, their hopes. Then they destroyed those things one by one while the future soldiers. Marcus Valerius, age 19, loved poetry. The priests made him recite his favorite verses while they slowly removed his fingers. Lucius Cornelius treasured letters from his wife. They forced him to burn them one by one before using the same flames to sear his flesh. Gaius Flavius believed in the gods. They made him blaspheme against every deity while nailing his tongue to a wooden post. The watching soldiers learned that nothing was sacred, nothing was safe. Love was weakness. Hope was delusion. Faith was foolishness. By the time the victim died, usually after 3 days of systematic psychological demolition, the witnesses had been rebuilt as emotional automatons programmed for a single function: kill without hesitation, without remorse, without humanity. Roman military records, hidden in the Bibliotheca Apostolica for centuries, detail the effectiveness of these methods. Legions that underwent devotio training showed casualty rates 40% lower than standard units, not because they were better fighters, but because they felt no fear, no compassion, no instinct for self-preservation that might make them hesitate at crucial moments. The rituals weren't limited to enlisted men. Roman officers, the patrician class that ruled the known world, participated in ceremonies that would make modern war criminals sick with horror. They called it the Sacramentum Sanguinis, the blood oath, and it transformed Rome's elite into something unprecedented in human history, a ruling class that felt genuine pleasure in suffering. Archaeological evidence exists in places the Catholic Church has spent centuries trying to hide. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica, excavations in 1950 uncovered chambers filled with human remains showing signs of prolonged torture. The Vatican immediately sealed the area, but not before archaeologist Antonio Ferrua documented bone modifications consistent with Roman ritual practices. His notes, leaked in 1978, describe evidence of systematic psychological torture refined over centuries. The Romans didn't just sacrifice individuals, they sacrificed entire concepts. Love, mercy, compassion, hope. These became sacrificial offerings to Ares, burned away from soldiers' minds, with the same methodical precision Romans applied to road building and aqueduct construction. They turned emotional destruction into infrastructure. Consider the logistics. A Roman legion required approximately 600 ritual deaths per campaign season. Multiply that by the dozens of legions active at any given time, and you're looking at systematic murder on an industrial scale. Conservative estimates suggest Rome killed over 100,000 of its own citizens in these rituals during the height of the empire. Not in battle, not defending territory, but in ceremonies designed to transform the survivors into perfect killers. The selection process was horrifyingly sophisticated. Roman augurs, the priests who claimed to read omens, were actually early psychologists who understood behavioral conditioning. They identified citizens whose deaths would create maximum trauma in their social circles. A popular young man whose friends would be devastated. A beloved son whose father served in the legions. A talented artist whose creative spirit needed to be extinguished before the witness's eyes. They documented everything. Papyrus scrolls found in Egyptian ruins contain detailed Roman analyses of optimal torture techniques for different personality types. Extroverts responded best to public humiliation before death. Introverts broke more effectively through isolation and sensory deprivation. Religious individuals required blasphemous torture that shattered their faith. Atheists needed pseudo-spiritual ceremonies that mocked their rationality. The social impact was catastrophic. Roman literature from this period, when analyzed through modern psychological frameworks, reveals a society-wide epidemic of what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Citizens developed elaborate coping mechanisms to avoid selection for sacrifice. Families splintered as parents tried to make their children less appealing to the priests. Friendships dissolved as associations became dangerous. Roman women created underground networks to hide their sons, smuggling them out of the city before selection ceremonies. Some records suggest entire extended families committed suicide rather than risk having a member chosen for sacrifice. The famous Roman Stoicism wasn't philosophical achievement, it was emotional numbing, a survival mechanism developed by a civilization that had weaponized trauma. The effects rippled outward through conquered territories. As Roman legions, traumatized and emotionally dead, conquered new lands, they brought their conditioning techniques with them. Local populations weren't just subjugated militarily, they were psychologically broken, using refined versions of Roman ritual torture. The famous Pax Romana wasn't peace. It was the silence of psychological devastation. Celtic tribes in Gaul adopted Roman sacrifice techniques to create warriors capable of fighting the legions. Germanic tribes along the Rhine developed their own variants. Archaeological sites across Europe show evidence of identical ritual patterns, systematic torture designed not just to kill, but to traumatize witnesses into emotional compliance. The Christian persecution under emperors like Nero and Diocletian wasn't religious intolerance, it was practical psychology. Christians maintained emotional bonds, love, hope, faith, that made them unsuitable for Roman military conditioning. They had to be eliminated not because of their beliefs, but because their capacity for human emotion made them incompatible with a military system that required emotional death. When Constantine converted Rome to Christianity in 313 CE, the official reason was divine revelation. The actual reason, found in documents discovered during Vatican renovation in 1968, was military necessity. The Roman Empire was collapsing because it had destroyed the psychological foundation necessary for complex civilization. They had created perfect soldiers, but eliminated the human qualities needed for administration, innovation, and social cohesion. The transition to Christianity represented desperate damage control. Church leaders, working secretly with Roman officials, developed new conditioning techniques that preserved military effectiveness while maintaining enough human emotion for basic social function. Early Christian monasteries weren't spiritual retreats, they were psychological rehabilitation centers trying to repair centuries of systematic trauma. The evidence for this interpretation exists in monastery records from the 4th and 5th centuries CE. Monks weren't just copying religious texts, They were documenting techniques for treating what modern psychologists would recognize as severe PTSD in Roman veterans. Prayer rituals were actually early forms of exposure therapy. Confession served as trauma counseling. Holy Communion symbolically reversed the blood rituals that had destroyed soldiers' capacity for human connection, but the underlying techniques survived. Medieval military orders like the Knights Templar incorporated Roman psychological conditioning into Christian frameworks. Crusader accounts describe rituals that would be familiar to any Roman centurion, systematic exposure to torture and death, designed to create emotionally dead warriors who could slaughter without hesitation. The medieval period wasn't the Dark Ages because of technological regression. It was dark because European civilization was still recovering from centuries of systematic psychological warfare against its own population. The famous medieval obsession with death and suffering wasn't morbid spirituality. It was cultural trauma expressing itself through art, literature, and religious practice. You want to know why medieval warfare was so brutal? Why knights could burn entire villages without apparent remorse? They were carrying forward psychological conditioning techniques developed by Roman priests of Ares, adapted to Christian terminology but fundamentally unchanged. The medieval code of chivalry wasn't moral improvement. It was damage control, desperate attempts to impose ethical limits on warriors who had been psychologically programmed to feel nothing. But even that wasn't the end. The techniques continued evolving, adapting, surviving through centuries of apparent civilization and progress. By the time European powers began their colonial expansions, they had perfected methods for creating soldiers capable of genocide while maintaining enough social function to return home and raise families. The conquistadors who destroyed entire civilizations in the Americas weren't uniquely evil. They were products of conditioning techniques that traced back to Roman groves, where citizens died screaming for Ares. The same psychological patterns, refined over centuries, exported to new continents, where they would create horrors that make ancient sacrifices seem almost merciful by comparison. You've seen the paintings. Noble conquistadors kneeling before golden altars, converting savage heathens to Christianity. Cortez meeting Moctezuma in a diplomatic handshake that changed history. Pizarro bringing civilization to the Inca. Beautiful lies painted over a truth so disturbing that 5 centuries later, governments still classify documents related to what really happened in those first encounters. The Spanish didn't just bring horses and gunpowder to the New World. They brought psychological warfare techniques perfected over 2 millennia of European military conditioning. But here's what your history books won't tell you. The Aztecs, Maya, and Inca weren't defenseless victims. They had their own versions of the same rituals, their own methods for creating warriors who could kill without hesitation. What happened in the Americas wasn't conquest. It was a collision between 2 evolved systems of human psychological destruction. When Cortez landed on the Yucatan coast in 1519, his first action wasn't diplomatic contact or territorial claims. According to documents discovered in the Archivo de Indias in 1934 and immediately transferred to Vatican custody, he ordered the construction of ritual sites modeled after Roman devotio altars. Before facing the Aztec Empire, Spanish soldiers underwent the same psychological conditioning their ancestors had used against Germanic tribes and Moorish kingdoms. The Spanish had refined the Roman techniques during 8 centuries of warfare against Muslim forces in Iberia. They called it the Reconquista, but surviving Arabic texts describe something far more sinister. Spanish military orders like the Knights of Santiago weren't just fighting for territory. They were experimenting with psychological warfare that combined Christian symbolism with ancient sacrifice rituals. Picture this: a hidden valley outside Toledo, 1491. The year before Columbus sails for the Americas, Spanish knights gather around stone altars carved with Christian crosses and pagan symbols. The victims aren't prisoners of war or criminals. They're Spanish peasants, carefully selected for their psychological value to the witnessing soldiers. A young farmer whose screams will echo in his brother's nightmare. An elderly craftsman whose slow death will teach watching knights that age and wisdom offer no protection from ultimate horror. The Spanish perfected what they called the auto de fe militar, the military act of faith. Unlike Inquisition tribunals that focused on heresy, these rituals targeted human compassion itself. Spanish soldiers were forced to participate in tortures so elaborate, so systematically dehumanizing, that modern international war crimes tribunals still use Spanish colonial records as examples of crimes against humanity, but the Aztecs were ready for them. Tenochtitlan wasn't just a magnificent city, it was the center of a psychological warfare system that made Roman practices seem primitive by comparison. Aztec priests had spent centuries developing ritual techniques that created warriors so emotionally dead, so completely divorced from human feeling, that Spanish conquistadors wrote home describing enemies who fought like demons incarnate. The famous Aztec flower wars weren't territorial conflicts. They were massive psychological conditioning operations designed to create warriors who could face any horror without flinching. Archaeological evidence from the Templo Mayor reveals sacrifice sites that processed thousands of victims annually, but not randomly. Aztec priests maintained detailed records of which psychological techniques produced the most effective traumatic conditioning in witness warriors. Spanish accounts, found in private collections and authenticated in the 1970s, describe Aztec warriors who showed no fear of death, no response to torture, no recognition of their own wounds during battle. These weren't brave men fighting for their homeland. They were psychological weapons, human beings so thoroughly broken and rebuilt that they no longer qualified as entirely human. The collision between these two systems created something unprecedented in recorded history. When Spanish psychological conditioning met Aztec psychological conditioning, the result was warfare that traumatized even the perpetrators. Conquistador letters, home, discovered in monastery archives during the 1980s, described nightmares that persisted decades after the conquest. Veterans who had survived the brutal Spanish campaigns against Islam broke down completely after facing Aztec warrior weapons. Cortés himself underwent psychological treatment from Spanish military chaplains trained in early trauma therapy techniques. His famous letters to King Charles V weren't just conquest reports. They were desperate attempts to process experiences that had shattered his conditioned emotional numbness. The man who had been psychologically programmed to feel nothing was struggling with feelings he couldn't identify or control. The same pattern repeated across the Americas. Francisco Pizarro, before conquering the Inca Empire, established ritual sites in the Peruvian highlands where Spanish soldiers underwent psychological conditioning that combined European techniques with local shamanic practices. The Spanish learned from indigenous priests, adopting and refining native psychological warfare methods that had been developing for centuries. Inca military conditioning focused on altitude-based sensory deprivation combined with systematic exposure to extreme violence. High in the Andes, where oxygen levels made normal thinking difficult, Inca priests conducted rituals that stripped away human emotional responses and replaced them with mechanical obedience to military command. Spanish documents describe Inca warriors who continued fighting with mortal wounds, showing no recognition of pain or fear of death. The resulting warfare wasn't conventional conquest. It was a psychological arms race between competing systems of human destruction. Spanish conquistadors, conditioned to feel nothing, fought indigenous warriors who had been conditioned to feel nothing. The massive civilian casualties resulted from psychological weapons accidentally unleashed on non-combatant populations. Disease played a role in indigenous population collapse, but not the way your textbooks suggest. Smallpox and typhus were devastating, but the real killer was psychological warfare spillover. Communities exposed to Spanish and indigenous psychological conditioning techniques experienced societal breakdown that made them vulnerable to diseases that would have been survivable under normal circumstances. Missionary records, hidden in Vatican archives for centuries, document the attempted reversal of military conditioning in surviving indigenous populations. Catholic priests weren't just converting souls, they were providing trauma therapy for entire civilizations that had been psychologically shattered by warfare between competing systems of human weaponization. The famous indigenous resistance movements weren't just fighting for an occupation. They were struggling to rebuild human emotional capacity in populations that had been systematically dehumanized by their own military systems, and then further traumatized by Spanish psychological warfare. Leaders like Tupac Amaru weren't just political rebels, they were attempting psychological reconstruction of entire culture. But the techniques didn't die with the conquest period. They evolved, adapted to colonial administration, plantation management, and territorial expansion. The encomienda system that enslaved indigenous populations wasn't just economic exploitation. It was psychological conditioning designed to create compliant labor forces through systematic trauma. Spanish colonial records, discovered during Mexican independence movements and immediately suppressed by successive governments, document psychological techniques that combined European military conditioning with indigenous traumatization methods. Colonial administrators weren't just governing territories, they were managing populations that had been psychologically broken and rebuilt as human tools. The same patterns spread north. English colonists in North America adopted Spanish techniques for managing indigenous populations, but adapted them to Protestant theological frameworks. The famous Puritan work ethic wasn't moral philosophy. It was psychological conditioning that used religious symbolism to create emotionally compliant populations capable of systematic violence when necessary. French colonial practices in Canada and Louisiana incorporated Catholic versions of Spanish techniques, creating fur trading networks that depended on psychologically conditioned indigenous allies capable of extreme violence during territorial disputes. Dutch colonial practices in New Amsterdam used Calvinist theology to justify psychological techniques that created merchant warriors capable of commercial ruthlessness and military effectiveness. Colonial warfare in North America represented the collision of multiple European psychological conditioning systems with diverse indigenous methods for creating warrior weapons. The result was conflicts like King Philip's War and the French and Indian War that traumatized entire regions and created lasting psychological damage that affected generations of survivors. The American Revolution wasn't just political independence, it was psychological rebellion against European systems of human conditioning that had created colonial populations capable of systematic violence, but incapable of genuine self-governance. The famous American individualism emerged as psychological recovery from centuries of conditioning designed to create compliant populations. But the underlying techniques survived the revolution. American military development incorporated European conditioning methods refined during colonial conflicts. The Continental Army that defeated British forces was psychologically conditioned, using techniques that traced back through Spanish conquistadors to Roman legions, to Spartan groves where young men died screaming for Ares. By the time Americans began their own westward expansion, they had perfected psychological conditioning techniques that combined European military methods with indigenous traumatization practices learned during colonial conflicts. The Indian Wars of the 19th century weren't just territorial conquest. They were laboratory experiments in psychological warfare that would influence military development for the next century. The famous American frontier spirit wasn't rugged individualism. It was psychological conditioning that created settlers capable of genocidal violence while maintaining enough social function to establish communities. Town founders, pioneer families, and territorial administrators were products of conditioning techniques that enabled systematic atrocities while preserving domestic stability. But the real horror was yet to come. By the mid-19th century, American military planners had access to psychological conditioning techniques refined over millennia of human conflict. As industrial technology advanced, they began combining ancient methods of psychological destruction with modern production capabilities. The result would be military systems that made Roman legions and Spanish conquistadors seem almost humane by comparison. The American Civil War wasn't just about slavery or states' rights. It was the first industrial-scale test of psychological conditioning techniques that had been developing since ancient Sparta. Both Union and Confederate forces used systematic trauma to create soldiers capable of the unprecedented slaughter that modern weapons made possible. You've seen the photographs. Rows of young men in blue and gray uniforms, staring stoically at cameras with dead eyes that haunt you even through sepia tones. You assume that look came from battlefield trauma, from witnessing the horror of Gettysburg or Antietam. But those photographs were taken before the first shots were fired. Those dead eyes were manufactured, deliberately created in training camps where American military leaders applied centuries of psychological conditioning to industrial-age warfare. The Civil War killed more Americans than all other conflicts combined, but not because of superior Confederate tactics or Union industrial capacity. It was because both sides had perfected techniques for creating soldiers who literally could not stop killing. Military records from both armies, sealed in the National Archives until the 1987 Freedom of Information Act lawsuit forced partial disclosure, reveal systematic psychological conditioning that transformed civilian volunteers into killing machines more efficient than anything previous wars had produced. Confederate General Robert E. Lee wasn't just a brilliant strategist. He was a student of European military conditioning who had spent years studying Spanish colonial techniques and Roman military psychology. Before the war, Lee traveled extensively through former Spanish territories, ostensibly surveying for railroad construction, but actually documenting psychological warfare methods used in colonial population control. Lee's pre-war notebooks, discovered during a 1961 renovation of his Arlington estate, contain detailed analyses of Spanish colonial conditioning techniques, including diagrams of ritual sacrifice sites and notes on optimal psychological trauma delivery. These weren't academic studies. They were practical manuals for implementing ancient techniques using modern organizational methods. The Confederate training camp at Camp Lee, outside Richmond, wasn't teaching military drill and weapon maintenance. Union prisoners who survived the war described systematic psychological conditioning that combined Southern honor culture with refined trauma technique. Confederate recruits underwent rituals that would have been familiar to Roman centurions, witnessing systematic torture and murder of selected victims while being conditioned to feel nothing. But the Union response was even more sophisticated. General Ulysses S. Grant had access to European military advisors who brought techniques refined during the Napoleonic Wars, which themselves incorporated methods developed during centuries of European religious warfare. Union training camps implemented psychological conditioning on an industrial scale, processing thousands of volunteers through standardized trauma protocols. The famous Union military discipline wasn't moral superiority, it was emotional death. Union soldiers showed remarkable resistance to battlefield stress, not because of better leadership, but because they had been psychologically conditioned to feel nothing. Letters home from Union soldiers, analyzed by military historians in the 1970s, reveal emotional patterns consistent with severe dissociative disorders. The key innovation was standardization. Previous military conditioning had been artisanal, customized to individual psychological profiles. Civil War conditioning applied mass production principles to psychological destruction. Training camps used assembly line methods to process recruits through standardized trauma sequences designed to eliminate human emotional responses while preserving military functionality. Confederate camps specialized in honor-based conditioning that used shame and social pressure to eliminate empathy. Recruits who showed compassion for training victims were subjected to public humiliation designed to associate human feeling with personal dishonor. The famous Confederate fighting spirit wasn't courage, it was psychological programming that made retreat or surrender literally unthinkable. Union camps focused on ideological conditioning that used moral righteousness to justify any level of violence. Recruits learned that enemy soldiers weren't human beings deserving mercy, but obstacles to moral progress that needed elimination. Union soldiers who committed atrocities during Sherman's march weren't acting against their training. They were following psychological programming that defined enemy populations as subhuman. The industrial scale was unprecedented. Conservative estimates suggest both armies processed over 400,000 soldiers through psychological conditioning protocols that killed approximately 12,000 training victims. These weren't battlefield casualties. They were deliberate sacrifices designed to traumatize witnesses into emotional compliance. Training camp mortality rates were officially attributed to disease and accidents, but surviving medical records tell a different story. Camp physicians documented systematic torture designed to create maximum psychological impact on witness recruits. Victims were selected using scientific methods that considered their social connections, personality types, and potential trauma value to watching soldiers. The psychological techniques weren't limited to enlisted men. Officer training incorporated advanced conditioning methods that combined European aristocratic traditions with American democratic ideals. Officers learned to feel genuine pleasure in subordinate suffering while maintaining social functionality necessary for post-war civilian leadership. Confederate officer conditioning drew on Southern plantation management techniques that had been refined over centuries of slave control. Officers learned psychological methods for maintaining absolute authority while appearing paternalistic and benevolent. The same techniques used to control enslaved populations were applied to military subordinates. Union officer conditioning incorporated Northern industrial management methods that treated human beings as production resources. Officers learned to calculate acceptable casualty rates with the same emotional detachment factory managers applied to equipment maintenance. Human life became a quantified resource to be expended efficiently. The battlefield results were catastrophic. Soldiers conditioned to feel nothing fought with mechanical persistence that made previous conflicts seem almost civilized by comparison. The famous charges at Gettysburg weren't heroic. They were psychological programming, overriding survival instincts. Men walked into artillery fire because their conditioning made retreat psychologically impossible. Medical records from Civil War hospitals reveal injury patterns consistent with soldiers who continued fighting despite mortal wounds. Battlefield physicians documented cases of soldiers who fought effectively while bleeding to death, showing no recognition of pain or awareness of their condition. This wasn't courage. It was psychological conditioning that had eliminated normal self-preservation responses. The civilian impact was equally devastating. Armies composed of psychologically conditioned soldiers showed no restraint when interacting with non-combatant populations. The systematic destruction during Sherman's march to the sea wasn't strategic necessity. It was conditioned soldiers following psychological programming that defined all enemy-associated populations as legitimate targets. Southern civilian populations experienced similar trauma from Confederate forces who had been conditioned to view any opposition to military objectives as treasonous. Confederate soldiers showed no mercy to Southern civilians who failed to provide absolute support, treating their own people with the same mechanical ruthlessness they applied to Union forces. The post-war period revealed the full horror of what had been created. Veterans from both armies returned home with psychological damage that affected entire communities for generations. The famous American frontier expansion was partially driven by veterans who could no longer function in normal social environments and needed isolated settings where their conditioned responses wouldn't trigger civilian trauma. Reconstruction wasn't just political reintegration. It was massive psychological rehabilitation attempting to reverse military conditioning that had created populations of traumatized veterans incapable of normal human relationships. The federal programs ostensibly designed to rebuild Southern infrastructure were actually therapy protocols developed by early military psychiatrists. But the techniques didn't disappear with peace. American military planners had documented the effectiveness of industrial-scale psychological conditioning and began developing applications for future conflicts. The Indian Wars of the late 19th century became testing grounds for refined conditioning techniques that combined Civil War lessons with frontier conditions. The systematic destruction of Native American populations wasn't just territorial expansion. It was laboratory experimentation with psychological conditioning methods that would influence military development into the 20th century. Army units that had been psychologically conditioned during Civil War training applied their programming to indigenous populations with mechanical efficiency. European military observers studied American Civil War conditioning techniques and began implementing similar programs in their own armies. The Franco-Prussian War, various colonial conflicts, and early 20th century European tensions were all influenced by psychological warfare methods that Americans had industrialized during their domestic conflict. By the 1890s, major military powers had access to standardized psychological conditioning protocols that could transform civilian populations into effective military forces within months. The ancient techniques that had started in Spartan groves dedicated to Ares had evolved into industrial systems capable of processing entire generations through psychological destruction and reconstruction. The Spanish-American War became the first international test of American psychological conditioning techniques. American soldiers who destroyed Filipino resistance movements weren't acting from racial prejudice or imperial ambition. They were following psychological programming that defined all non-American populations as potential enemies requiring elimination. But the real test was approaching. European powers were developing their own versions of American conditioning techniques while refining traditional methods that traced back through centuries of continental warfare. The collision of these competing systems would create a conflict so psychologically devastating that its effects would reshape human civilization. World War I wasn't caused by alliance systems or imperial competition. It was the inevitable result of multiple psychological conditioning systems that had created populations incapable of resolving conflicts through normal diplomatic means. European leaders who had been conditioned to view violence as the ultimate solution to any problem found themselves unable to prevent a war that would demonstrate the full horror of industrialized psychological conditioning applied to modern weapons technology. The trenches of the Western Front weren't just military fortifications, they were psychological laboratories where competing conditioning systems met in direct confrontation. The famous shell shock wasn't battle fatigue. It was the breakdown of psychological conditioning when soldiers encountered enemies who had been conditioned using different but equally effective techniques. You've seen the footage. Hollow-eyed soldiers stumbling through muddy trenches, their faces blank with what historians call the 1,000-yard stare. You assumed that emptiness came from witnessing the horror of industrialized warfare. But those men looked that way before they ever saw their first artillery barrage. That vacant expression was manufactured in training camps across Europe, where military psychologists had perfected techniques that made Roman devotio rituals seem like gentle therapy sessions. World War I wasn't the Great War because of its scale or technological innovation. It was great because it represented the first global collision of industrialized psychological conditioning systems that had been developing independently across multiple continents. When German soldiers who had been conditioned using Prussian methods met British soldiers conditioned using techniques refined in colonial India, the result was warfare that broke the human psyche on a species level. The German military had spent decades studying American Civil War conditioning techniques while developing their own methods based on Teutonic warrior traditions that traced back to conflicts with Roman legions. German training camps implemented what they called Seelen Tod, literally soul death, using systematic psychological destruction that combined ancient Germanic practices with modern scientific principles. German recruits underwent conditioning in facilities hidden throughout the Bavarian forests, sites that had been used for similar purposes since pre-Christian times. Archaeological evidence, discovered during post-war denazification efforts and immediately classified, reveals stone altars that show continuous use for psychological conditioning rituals spanning over 2 millennia. The German technique focused on what military psychologists called Schmerzlosigkeit, painlessness, not physical anesthesia, but complete emotional numbness. German soldiers were conditioned to feel literally nothing. No fear, no compassion, no self-preservation instinct, no recognition of their own mortality. They became human weapons that fought with mechanical precision until physically destroyed. But the British response was equally sophisticated. British military conditioning drew on centuries of imperial experience managing populations across the globe. British training camps implemented psychological techniques that had been refined in India, Africa, and Ireland, adapted for European warfare using scientific methods developed at Cambridge and Oxford. The British technique emphasized what they termed controlled savagery, soldiers who could switch between civilized behavior and systematic brutality, depending on command requirements. British conditioning created warriors who could slaughter German prisoners in the morning and write loving letters home in the evening, showing no psychological connection between these activities. French conditioning focused on what they called l'honneur mort, dead honor, psychological programming that used national pride to eliminate individual identity. French soldiers were conditioned to view themselves as expendable components of France itself, capable of any sacrifice because personal survival was irrelevant compared to abstract national concepts. The collision of these systems created warfare that traumatized even the perpetrators. Military medical records from all combatant nations, sealed for decades after the war and only partially declassified in the 1970s, document psychological breakdown rates that suggest the conditioning techniques were failing under the stress of encountering equally conditioned enemies. Shell shock wasn't combat fatigue. It was systematic psychological conditioning colliding with competing conditioning systems. When German soldiers conditioned to feel nothing encountered British soldiers conditioned to feel nothing, the result was cognitive dissonance that shattered both systems simultaneously. Soldiers on all sides began experiencing emotional responses they had been conditioned to suppress, creating psychological chaos that manifested as the symptoms doctors called shell shock. The famous Christmas truce of 1914 wasn't spontaneous human decency breaking through military discipline. It was temporary psychological conditioning failure that allowed suppressed human emotions to surface briefly. Military commanders on all sides were horrified because the truce demonstrated that their conditioning systems could be disrupted, threatening the entire basis of modern warfare. The rapid suppression of fraternization and the extreme punishments imposed on soldiers who participated weren't motivated by military necessity. They were panic responses by commanders who realized their psychological conditioning systems were more fragile than expected. Military psychology documents from the period reveal desperate attempts to reinforce conditioning protocols to prevent future emotional breakthroughs. The scale of conditioning breakdown was unprecedented. Conservative estimates suggest over 200,000 soldiers from all combatant nations experienced complete psychological conditioning failure, requiring removal from combat not because of physical wounds, but because they had recovered their suppressed human emotions and could no longer function as weapons. Military psychiatric facilities established during the war weren't treating combat trauma. They were attempting to repair broken psychological conditioning. Treatment protocols focused on re-implementing emotional suppression rather than healing psychological damage. Soldiers who recovered enough to return to combat hadn't been cured. They had been successfully reconditioned. The famous war poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon weren't expressing universal human responses to war's horror. They were documenting the psychological experience of conditioning breakdown, the terrifying recovery of suppressed emotions in men who had been programmed to feel nothing. Their poetry reads like medical reports from psychological reconditioning subjects. The civilian impact was equally devastating. Populations that had been prepared for war through systematic psychological conditioning found themselves unable to process the scale of casualties and destruction. The famous homefront morale problems weren't war weariness, they were mass psychological conditioning failure, as civilian populations recovered suppressed human emotions. The influenza pandemic that killed millions wasn't just biological catastrophe, it was psychological warfare spillover. Populations that had been psychologically conditioned for military support showed compromised immune responses when their conditioning systems failed. The pandemic disproportionately affected regions where psychological conditioning had been most intensive. Revolutionary movements that emerged during and after the war weren't political responses to military failure. They were psychological rebellion by populations whose conditioning systems had collapsed, leaving them unable to accept traditional authority structures that depended on emotional suppression. The Russian Revolution was mass psychological deconditioning expressing itself through political violence. The Bolsheviks didn't just seize political power, they implemented alternative psychological conditioning systems based on ideological rather than military principles. Soviet techniques combined Russian Orthodox mystical traditions with modern scientific principles, creating population conditioning methods that influenced global politics for the next century. The post-war period revealed the full scope of psychological devastation. Veterans from all nations returned home with damaged conditioning systems that made normal civilian life impossible. The famous lost generation wasn't expressing philosophical disillusionment. They were populations of psychologically damaged individuals struggling to function. In societies their conditioning had taught them to ignore. American participation in the war represented the global export of psychological conditioning techniques that had been refined during the Civil War and Indian Wars. American expeditionary forces brought industrial-scale conditioning methods to European warfare, contributing to the psychological breakdown that characterized the war's final phases. But military planners learned from the conditioning failures. Interwar military development focused on creating more resilient psychological conditioning systems that could withstand contact with competing techniques. German military psychology, later applied by the Nazi regime, developed conditioning methods that combined traditional techniques with modern propaganda and scientific behavioral modification. Soviet psychological conditioning evolved during the same period, creating population management systems that could maintain control over hundreds of millions of people, while preparing them for potential military mobilization. Soviet techniques influenced communist movements worldwide, spreading psychological conditioning methods disguised as political ideology. The development of fascist psychological conditioning represented the merger of ancient techniques with modern mass communication. Fascist rallies weren't political events. They were mass psychological conditioning sessions that used carefully orchestrated sensory manipulation to implement emotional suppression on unprecedented scales. By the 1930s, major world powers had access to psychological conditioning systems that made World War I techniques seem primitive by comparison. The approaching Second World War would demonstrate the full horror of what happened when these refined systems met in global conflict. But the most disturbing development was the civilian application of military conditioning techniques. Populations across Europe and North America were being prepared for war through systematic psychological conditioning disguised as education, entertainment, and social organization. The famous pre-war prosperity wasn't economic recovery, it was the calm before a psychological storm that would reshape human civilization. The youth movements of the 1930s weren't social organizations. They were mass conditioning systems preparing entire generations for psychological destruction. Hitler Youth, Soviet pioneers, and similar movements in democratic nations were all implementing techniques that traced back through centuries of military conditioning to ancient groves where young men died screaming for Ares. By 1939, multiple competing psychological conditioning systems had prepared their populations for conflict using techniques so refined, so systematically dehumanizing, that the resulting warfare would make World War I seem almost restrained by comparison. The Holocaust, the Eastern Front, the Pacific Theater, these weren't military campaigns, but the logical result of competing systems that had spent decades conditioning populations to view enemy groups as subhuman obstacles requiring elimination. But even World War II wouldn't be the end. The techniques would survive, evolve, adapt to post-war conditions where open military conflict became impossible between major powers. The Cold War wouldn't be fought with armies, but with psychological conditioning systems applied to entire populations over decades of apparent peace. You think you're free? Sitting there in your comfortable chair, making your own choices, living in a democratic society where individual liberty is sacred. But while you've been enjoying the illusion of freedom, the same psychological conditioning techniques that created Spartan killing machines and Roman legions have been applied to your entire civilization. The Cold War wasn't about nuclear weapons or competing ideologies. It was the final evolution of techniques that began in ancient groves where young men died screaming for Ares. The Manhattan Project wasn't just developing atomic weapons. Hidden within the classified research programs were psychological studies that combined ancient conditioning techniques with modern behavioral science. Documents released through Freedom of Information Act lawsuits in the 1990s reveal that nuclear weapons were secondary to the primary mission, developing psychological conditioning systems that could control entire populations without their knowledge or consent. Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, the psychiatrist who conducted MKUltra experiments, wasn't a rogue researcher exploring mind control. He was continuing work that had been systematically developed through millennia of military conditioning, applying ancient techniques to modern populations using scientific methods. His psychic driving experiments were direct descendants of Roman devotio rituals, adapted for post-war civilian populations. The CIA didn't invent psychological warfare. They industrialized it. Operation Paperclip brought Nazi psychologists to America, not just for their rocket technology, but for their refined understanding of mass psychological conditioning. Nazi techniques had combined Germanic warrior traditions with modern propaganda, creating population control methods that American intelligence agencies adapted for democratic societies. But the Soviets were equally sophisticated. The KGB Psychological Warfare Division implemented conditioning techniques that combined Russian Orthodox mystical traditions with Marxist ideology, creating population management systems that influenced global politics for decades. Soviet techniques spread through international communist movements, implementing psychological conditioning disguised as political education. The famous suburban prosperity of the 1950s wasn't economic success. It was mass psychological conditioning designed to create compliant populations capable of systematic violence when required. Suburban communities were carefully designed psychological environments that used consumer culture to implement emotional conditioning previously achieved through military training. Television wasn't entertainment technology. It was the most sophisticated psychological conditioning system ever developed. Programming schedules, advertising techniques, and content selection were all designed using principles developed through centuries of military psychological conditioning. Your grandparents didn't watch TV. They underwent systematic psychological modification in their own homes. The space race wasn't scientific competition. It was psychological warfare testing. Both American and Soviet space programs used public engagement to implement mass conditioning protocols. Citizens who followed space missions weren't expressing patriotic interest. They were participating in psychological conditioning experiments that prepared entire populations for potential conflict. Educational systems implemented during the post-war period weren't designed to create informed citizens. They were mass conditioning facilities that used academic curricula to implement emotional suppression techniques previously reserved for military training. Your parents didn't attend school. They underwent psychological conditioning that prepared them for adult compliance with authority systems. The counterculture movements of the 1960s weren't spontaneous rebellion against established authority. They were controlled psychological experiments designed to test the limits of civilian conditioning systems. Hippies, anti-war protesters, and civil rights activists were unwitting subjects in studies that refined techniques for managing population dissent. Vietnam wasn't a military conflict. It was a psychological conditioning laboratory where American military planners tested refined techniques on both soldiers and civilian populations. The famous anti-war movement wasn't organic protest. It was a controlled experiment in managing population psychology during extended conflict. Military records from Vietnam, partially declassified in the 1980s, reveal psychological conditioning protocols that combine traditional military techniques with civilian population management methods. American soldiers underwent conditioning that was more sophisticated than anything used in previous conflicts, while Vietnamese populations experienced systematic psychological warfare that influenced an entire generation. But the real innovation was applying military conditioning to civilian populations without their knowledge. Consumer culture, entertainment industry, educational systems, and social institutions were all redesigned using principles developed through millennia of military psychological conditioning. Post-war American society wasn't democratic freedom. It was the largest psychological conditioning experiment in human history. The Cold War ended not because of political changes or economic collapse, but because both superpowers had achieved their objective: complete psychological conditioning of their populations. Nuclear weapons became unnecessary when entire civilizations had been conditioned to accept any level of authority control without conscious resistance. Modern terrorism isn't political violence. It's psychological conditioning spill over from populations that have been systematically conditioned for decades. Terrorist organizations use the same techniques that created Spartan warriors and Roman legions, adapted for contemporary conditions. Your response to terrorist attacks isn't natural human fear. It's conditioned psychological compliance designed to increase acceptance of authority control. The internet wasn't developed for information sharing. It was designed as a psychological conditioning system that could monitor and modify individual behavior on unprecedented scales. Social media platforms implement conditioning techniques that would have impressed Roman military psychologists. Every click, every like, every share is psychological conditioning disguised as social interaction. Modern military conflicts aren't fought with traditional armies. They're psychological conditioning operations applied to entire populations through information warfare. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan weren't territorial conquest. They were testing grounds for refined civilian conditioning techniques that are now being applied to domestic populations. Your smartphone isn't communication technology. It's a personal psychological conditioning device that monitors your behavior and implements modification protocols throughout your daily routine. The same principles that created Spartan killing machines now adjust your consumer preferences, political opinions, and social relationships through algorithmic manipulation you can't detect. Educational systems have evolved beyond simple indoctrination. They now implement psychological conditioning that begins in early childhood and continues through university programs. Your children aren't learning critical thinking. They're undergoing systematic psychological modification that prepares them for adult compliance with systems they won't recognize as control mechanisms. Entertainment industry content isn't artistic expression. It's mass psychological conditioning that uses emotional engagement to implement behavioral modification. Movies, music, and literature all serve psychological conditioning objectives that trace back through centuries of military training to ancient rituals where young men died for Ares. Political systems aren't democratic representation. They're psychological conditioning management structures that channel population behavior while maintaining the illusion of choice. Elections don't determine policy. They serve as psychological conditioning events that reinforce population compliance with predetermined authority structures. The climate change movement isn't environmental activism. It's mass psychological conditioning designed to implement population control through manufactured crisis responses. The same techniques used to condition soldiers for combat are being applied to civilian populations to create acceptance of lifestyle modifications that would have been impossible through direct authority commands. Modern medical systems implement psychological conditioning through pharmaceutical interventions that modify behavior and emotional responses. Mental health treatment isn't therapy. It's systematic psychological conditioning that eliminates individual resistance to authority control while maintaining functional social compliance. But here's the most disturbing truth. The techniques are accelerating. Artificial intelligence systems are implementing psychological conditioning protocols that operate faster and more efficiently than any human system in history. Machine learning algorithms are refining conditioning techniques in real time, adapting to individual psychological profiles with precision that would have amazed ancient priests of Ares. The next phase won't require physical conditioning facilities or conscious participation. Psychological modification will be implemented through environmental controls, pharmaceutical interventions, and technological interfaces that bypass conscious awareness entirely. The perfect soldiers that Spartan priests created through ritual sacrifice will be replicated through systematic population conditioning that leaves no individual unmodified. You want to know the final horror? It's already complete. The psychological conditioning systems that began in ancient groves dedicated to Ares have achieved their ultimate objective. Entire civilizations that accept systematic control while believing they're exercising individual freedom. You're not reading this because you chose to. You're reading it because psychological conditioning systems determined that your awareness of these techniques poses no threat to their continued operation. The god of war doesn't need sacrificial altars anymore. He has your entire civilization, conditioned over millennia to accept violence as the ultimate solution to any problem, trained to feel nothing, as authority systems implement control techniques that would have impressed ancient priests. You are the sacrifice now, offered up not in a ritual grove, but in the comfort of your own home. Your humanity systematically stripped away while you browse social media and watch entertainment programs. But this story didn't end when you finished reading it. The next time you feel inexplicably angry at political opponents you've never met, Remember the Spartan warriors watching their friends die screaming. The next time you accept authority decisions, without question, think about Roman soldiers drinking their comrades' blood. The next time you scroll through your phone without thinking, recall the psychological conditioning techniques that have been refined over 2,000 years of systematic human destruction, and realize how little we've really changed, if we've changed at all.